Hello and welcome to Never Mind the Bar Charts with myself, Mark Pack. For this show, I'm joined once again by Duncan Brack. After the popularity of our show a few weeks back, looking at the lessons for the Liberal Democrats from Jo Grimond's time as party leader, I've invited Duncan back to talk about another former leader. This time, we're going to be talking about David Steel. So welcome back, Duncan.
Thank you very much. Good to be here again.
Let's quickly recap the outlines of David Steel's career to kick us off. He was elected as an MP in a by-election in 1965, still in his 20s. He became party leader in 1976 following the departure of Jeremy Thorpe, mired in scandal. And then shortly afterwards followed the Lib Lab Pact, when the Liberals kept Labour in office during a hung parliament in the late 1970s. Then there was the formation of the SDP and the SDP Liberal Alliance in the 1980s, with Steel's famous speech telling colleagues to go back to your constituencies and prepare for government. Government didn't follow, however, and after two failed attempts by the Alliance to break through at general elections, the Liberals and SDP merged, with Steel deciding not to run as leader of the merged party, which became the Liberal Democrats. And in fact, our first leader was therefore Paddy Ashdown. Now, Steel's political career didn't end there, and he had, for example, time as the first presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament when it was created in the 1990s. But for this show, we're going to concentrate on his time as party leader, and in particular, what lessons we can draw in terms of political strategy for the Liberal Democrats in the current and future decades. So to kick off, Duncan, I mean, relations with other parties really dominated David Steel's time as leader. You know, the choice to go into the Lib Lab Pact, the decision to encourage others to form the SDP rather than trying to get them to join the Liberals directly, and then making an electoral pact with that new party that formed the SDP. So what do you see as Steel's overall strategy running through those different events?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's right that we look at David Steel again. I think for many members of the party, probably don't know very much about him, but he was really quite a critical leader at an important stage in the party's development. And I think the party changed, certainly in the public mind, quite dramatically from the beginning of his leadership to the end. And he was, let's remember, the longest serving Liberal leader since Asquith, who was in post for 12 years, which none of his successors have managed so far. So
it's quite striking, actually, isn't it? Because 12 years doesn't instinctively strike me as a very large number. That's quite. I'm not sure what that says about what happens to leaders of our party. But.
Well, they seem to be changing every year at the moment, which is hopefully the next one will stay a bit longer than recent ones. But I mean, you have to remember leadership is a really taxing thing to do. And in fact, Steel almost stood down. In fact, he did resign in 1983 and then withdrew his resignation letter like the next day. He was exhausted after the 1983 election. He'd been leader then for 7 years. He has also, of course, he always sat for a Scottish Borders seat, which was really widespread. I actually worked for Archie Kirkwood, who was his next door neighbour for 2 years rather. So I got to know the area quite well. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's very widespread. No major centres of population. It's very widespread. So lots of little towns and villages. You have to spend a lot of time going around the constituency. Add on to that the chores of being leader. It takes it out of you, and I think all our leaders get worn down in the end. The next longest after Steel was Paddy, who was leader for 11 years, wasn't he? It's one of those things. It's a really taxing job to do. But I think, coming back to your original question, yes, I think working with other parties was a consistent theme of Steel, in the same way that it had been for Grimond in very different circumstances, and the same way it was to be for Ashdown. And it is a rational response to the position third parties, small third parties or fourth parties find themselves in an electoral system that's dominated unfairly because of the electoral system by the two major parties. It's very unlikely.
Something to add to that as well is that with both Grimond and Steel, they hadn't yet seen the events of things like the 1980s, where there was occasions where the third party could maybe not realistically, but at least dream of breaking through and replacing one of the other main parties. There are times in the 1980s when that seemed like that might be possible. There were times when Lib Dems got ludicrously overexcited about that in the 1990s. it was only last year that the Lib Dems outpolled both Labour and the Tories in a national election, albeit European Parliament election. So I think one of the things we need to remember about Steele and Grimond is that however implausible we might think some of those dreams subsequently were, at their time, it really did seem like the idea of the Liberals returning to being the second or the first party was way, way off, and therefore they needed some other plan for what you do other than just toddle along and look after your own constituency.
Yes, I think that's right. And the Liberals, after all, scored. The two-party system was beginning to break down in the 60s and 70s. And you can see that in the revival of the Liberal Party. And Jeremy Thorpe Steele's predecessor took the party to 19% and 18% in the two elections in 1974. But that faded very quickly. And people saw the Liberal vote pretty much then as a protest vote. And indeed, it was a protest vote. There was very little coherence to it in terms of voting, the characteristics of people who voted for it. We actually have a much more coherent vote now, even at our current low levels of support. And Steele helped to change that, I think, and began to build more of an image of a kind of responsible party, something you could vote for and possibly expect to see win. But he approached that through trying to work with other parties. I think, as well as the things you mentioned, the European referendum, the first EU referendum in 1975 was very important. Before Steele was leader, but he was chief whip at the time, I think, or foreign affairs spokesman. But he played an important part in the cross-party campaign to retain Britain's membership of the EU. And built good relations with other people in the campaign, like Roy Jenkins, like the Labour moderates, the pro-EU Labour moderates at the time. And that was an important episode, I think. And then just less than a year into his leadership, the Labour government of Jim Callaghan, who replaced Harold Wilson, lost its majority it had a wafer-thin majority anyway in October 74, lost through by-elections and defections. And the new Conservative leader, Margaret Thatcher, put down the vote of no confidence. And the government was going to lose. If anyone's seen James Graham's play This House, they will understand the febrile nature of parliamentary politics there. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it totally. It's a brilliant play, just about how you survive as a government with no overall majority and the desperate things the whips had to do to keep the government on the road. The Callaghan did a deal with Steele to form the Lib-Lab Pact, and the government survived the vote of no confidence, and basically it could then rely on pretty much a majority in most votes for the next 18 months until the pact expired. And you can argue about what the pact achieved in terms of Liberal outcomes for Liberal policy, and generally the conclusion is not very much. But I think for Steele, that wasn't the important thing. He wanted to demonstrate that Liberals could play a part in the governance of the country, even if from the background supporting the government. They were important. They mattered to the major political parties in a way in which they hadn't done before since the 1920s, really. And it demonstrated that Liberals were not just a kind of party of protest, something on the fringes. They were an important part of government and politics. And that changed, I think it began to change the image of the Liberal Party in people's minds.
And a somewhat, I guess, unkind, but with a degree of truth way of describing, I think, the Lib-Lab Pact is that Steele prioritised the idea of Liberal MPs being photographed walking into Downing Street and didn't really prioritise what on earth then happened once they were in Downing Street. So the Lib-Lab Pact resulted in Liberal MPs voting to keep Labour in power, but not only were there no ministerial posts or anything like that in return, there was very, very little in the way of policies that the Labour government therefore delivered. It wasn't like the Liberals had a wish list of policy. So even in things like David Steele's own memoirs, there's some stuff about profit-related pay. It's a pretty, for propping up a government, it's a pretty thin list of policy concessions, and perhaps best epitomised by the policy concession on electoral reform was to have a free vote on PR for the European Parliament elections. And of course, if you have a free vote, well, Labour and Tory MPs roll out and vote against PR, and so you had a free vote, and then PR didn't happen. That the policy gains were really, really meagre, weren't they?
Yes, that's correct. There are a few items in budgets like encouragement for employee share ownership, worker participation, there's a bit of stuff around rural constituencies. The Liberal Party blocked some of the more kind of left-wing nationalisation initiatives of the Labour government, but it didn't really make a lot of difference. And Steele was criticised at the time for that. John Pardo, who was his leadership contender the year before, commented that David was far more interested in just reaching agreement than what the agreement contained. But as I said, I don't think that mattered too much to Steele. It was the image of the party exercising influence over government that mattered. And he could point, reasonably enough actually, to the way in which they gave the government a stable majority in which it hadn't before. And there's a lot of talk at the time, and people won't remember this. I was just getting interested in politics myself at the time, but there was considerable talk about Britain becoming ungovernable. The economy seemed to be in a real mess. We'd had to apply for this massive loan from the IMF, which developed countries normally don't do. Inflation was very large, unemployment was high, the trade unions seemed to have too much control over the reins of the economy. And people were publishing books about, is British democracy finished, basically? And that was a constant theme of the kind of early and mid-70s. And the government seemed to be, with no majority at all, or a very small majority, seemed to be unable to carry through its programme. And the Lib Lab Pact brought an end to that, and it did give stable government for 18 months. Inflation began to fall. The economy seemed to begin to recover then. Now, whether it would have happened anyway without the pact is not clear. But I think there's a reasonable argument to say that the pact did result in government stability. But I said again, that wasn't, for Steele, that was secondary. It was the image of the government, image of the Liberals supporting the government and being a major player in government that mattered.
Yeah, and I think as you say, very hard to know exactly how the what if would have played out had the Lib Lab Pact not been agreed. Although I think things like the nationalisation that you mentioned, the Lib Lab Pact stopping. If there had been no Lib Lab Pact, Liberal MPs would have not voted, I think, for that nationalisation anyway. So it's not as if that would have been able to get through Parliament. But I'm struck by a little bit of a parallel with 2010 in a way, where although the Lib Dem negotiating team in 2010 definitely had a long list of specific policy demands, and quite a lot of those were successfully achieved in the negotiations. Although, interestingly, again, PR result, the PR promise was one that then didn't actually result in PR being introduced. But in 2010, again, there was that sense of actually stability is really important. We need to just provide stability. And I do wonder whether, both in the Liberals and then the Liberal Democrats, we give, as it were, too much credence to that in terms of almost thinking a little bit like civil servants as opposed to, politicians, where, stability is nice, but it's not the desired end state. A liberal society, I don't think is one where you would say there is long-term stable government necessarily. Indeed, there seems something slightly illiberal about having sort of long-term stability in some way. So, but as you say, I think against the backdrop of the 1970s, that was an extended version of the pre-2010 financial crash, wasn't it? There was a real sense of just, is democracy possible? Can democracy still function in Britain?
Yes, that's right. As I said, there was real fear of just the system of government not working and the economy just descending into chaos. In the same way, I guess we began to see, the Greek debt crisis exploded the day after the 2010 election, I think, and that really influenced the behaviour of the Lib Dem negotiators in coalition, and I think probably led them to give in to conservative demands on the economy, which in retrospect, I think was one of the biggest mistakes that the coalition made. But actually, the broader point is, I think the coalition negotiators, the Lib Dems, learned from the pact that actually coalition was better than, or in theory, coalition would be better than a confidence and supply arrangement, which is basically what the Lib Lab Pact was, in that you had, unlike the pact, you actually had ministers in place able to do things and to, again, in theory, get credit for them, which you didn't have in the pact. There was no direct influence on government policy. It was all behind the scenes. But I think
what happened electorally, but in the opinion polls and then in the election in 79, was that it being a much looser arrangement in terms of Lib Lab Pact rather than the coalition, that didn't seem to really help the Liberals, did it? It's not like people thought, well, you're not really part of the government, you're not really propping them up because you weren't ministers. It was very much the party suffered in a way similar to how the Lib Dems suffered in 2015, with the key exception that just before the 1979 general election, David Alton pulled off a stunning parliamentary by-election victory up in Liverpool, which in many ways revived the Liberal Party's fortunes just in time for general election polling day. The 79 election result could easily have been far, far worse than it was.
Well, I think a couple of things happened there. I think, first of all, the pact, unlike the coalition, the pact ended 6 months before polling day, actually more than 6 months, in autumn 78. The Labour government's failure to support PR for the European elections was a critical moment. And actually from then, that vote in December 77, the rest of the pact was always a struggle. It wasn't the kind of optimistic nature of the first 9 months or so.
Although, again, there was the lesson that the Lib Dems drew in 2010 to 15 was coming out of the Lib-Lab Pact 6 months before a general election didn't help in 79. Hence, coming out of the coalition a bit before the 2015 election wouldn't be worthwhile either.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, as you say, Lib Dems were more associated with coalition in 2010, 2015 than the Liberals were with the government in 77, 78. And certainly the party lost support during the pact in pretty much the same way the Lib Dems did in coalition. In fact, the fall was steeper. The party lost 3/4 of the county council seats it was defending in 77. It came regularly fourth in by-elections behind the National Front or Scottish or Welsh nationalists. I think the Glee Club song "Losing Deposits" stems from that era, actually, because then, of course, the deposit level was 12.5%. So we lost deposits in a whole string of by-elections, and that stopped pretty much in 78 when the party departed the pact, and pretty much stabilised around about, I think, the 10% level. You're absolutely right. The Edgehill by-election just on the day after the government fell, ironically. So immediately the winner, David Alton, would have to face another election campaign. That was a major boost to the party's morale, quite apart from anything else, and also its public image. But also, I think we need to remember, and we're discussing David Steele after all. Steele fought a very, very good campaign in 1979. And I think if you look at the opinion polls, we managed to add 5 or 6% to the poll during the campaign. And that is quite a substantial achievement, and raising it from below 10% up to the end, I think it was about 14%. And that saved most of the Liberal MPs. There was one projection at the beginning of the campaign that the Liberals would be down to just 2 seats by the end. And in fact, in the end, they saved 11 out of the 14 that had gone into the election. And the Liberal manifesto was very well regarded. The Guardian awarded it, I think, 42 points for new ideas, compared to 11 and 9 for the other two main parties. And Steele's final party election broadcast was rated as one of the best of certainly of the campaign, in fact, of many campaigns by observers. Politics seemed to be getting increasingly polarized then. You had Thatcher taking the Conservatives to the right. You had trade unions and the whole sort of economic chaos and the socialist pressure on the left. Callahan himself wasn't particularly radical. There was obviously forces in the Labour Party driving the party to the left. And Steele was trying to appeal then to the kind of the moderate centre, people who, who worried about this polarization of politics. And actually, he was quite effective in doing so. And that was to become the theme, of course, of the alliance, very much their image. But Steele played that card in 79. And I think he himself said of the 3 general elections he fought, 79 was the one which he thought he did the best. And I think it made the most difference to the party's fortunes.
And he had the advantage of being the third party leader. So, for example, the Granada 500 series of TV debates, which Granada TV pioneered over several elections in the 1970s, where they would focus in on a group of voters in a particular constituency and do things such as have each of the party leaders face questioning from a panel of those voters. Because, of course, back then, all TV debates had not yet become an acceptable format. And therefore, it was, one leaders would appear one after the other in sequence. But looking at the polling that was done around the Granada 500 appearances of Steele and Margaret Thatcher and Jim Callaghan, Steele came out pretty well from those. He came out popular across the political spectrum, more so on the centre left than on the sort of the centre right. So again, that sort of sense of the Liberals being maybe a little bit more closer to Labour than the Tories was there. But also crucially, he was one of the three leaders. You know, it wasn't the Granada 500 had a show where there was Mrs. Thatcher, and then there was Jim Callaghan, and then there were 7 others, of whom David Steel was one, that he had that big advantage. I do wonder, though, whether part of the legacy of the Lib Lab Pact is that it gave the party a set of lessons that we thought we were applying in 2010, but the lessons were fundamentally the wrong ones. In the problem with both the Lib Lab Pact and with the 2010 to 15 coalition, in a way, was the message the party had used in the preceding general election. So if you look at the Lib Dem messaging in the 2010 election or the Liberal Party messaging in the 1974 elections, they were both versions of a plague on all your houses. And how do you go from a general election campaign in which you say a plague on everyone to, okay, we're going to cozy up to one of you? Whatever form that might be in, Lib Lab Pact, a more formal confidence and supply arrangement, a coalition, perhaps the real lesson is that if you think you might have a hung parliament, you need to be very aware of the downside of going into that with a campaign that is everyone else is awful, we're completely different from them.
Yes, I think that's true. Though I think the circumstances of the pact were rather different. I mean, after all, Steele hadn't been leader in 74. The election had been 2.5 years before. In fact, Callaghan hadn't been a Labour leader either. There'd been quite a big change in the intervening period. And I think there was a reasonable case there that the government couldn't carry on as it was. And indeed, if the Liberals hadn't supported the government in the vote of no confidence, if they'd voted with the opposition, with Thatcher, the government would have fallen and we would have had an election in March 77, April 77, which the Conservatives would have won quite easily. So we'd have had Thatcherism 2 years earlier than we actually did. So I think the circumstances are a bit different. But I think you're right in the sense that, and experience from other democracies bears this out as well, junior partners in coalitions always have a tough time, pretty much. They have to be able to show that they've made a real concrete difference. And I think we didn't in the coalition. Opinion polls showed that by the end of the coalition, people just didn't have any idea what the Lib Dems had done. It wasn't like they particularly disliked us, though there was some of that as well because of tuition fees, mainly. But they just saw the government as a Conservative government because they couldn't see the Lib Dems had made any difference to it. I think in retrospect, they might be able to see that wasn't a fair judgment, but at the time it was. So I think if we are going to talk about coalition in the future, we have to be we have to make a major difference and be seen to make a major difference. And also, I think, to be honest, we shouldn't enter into coalition unless there's a cast iron guaranteed legislation for PR, because I think then that changes everything. And of course, we never managed to do that in either the pact or the coalition. Yeah,
I mean, I guess I would frame it slightly differently, which is, I think there clearly are differences between, say, coalition and confidence and supply. And they're important ones to think about because hung parliaments are likely again in the future. But the much bigger factor is what's the message that you've run up to it with, so that, as I absolutely agree with you, you need to be able to say, here is something concrete we've delivered, but also crucially, that needs to be something concrete that you delivered that was a part of the reason people had for voting for you in the first place. And I think this is one of the problems with the £10,000 income tax allowance in the 2010 to 15 period, isn't it? Is that, it was a good policy. It helped. It helped a whole load of people, particularly who needed help from the government. So it was a good policy in many ways. But fundamentally, you vote Lib Dem to get income tax cut. Well, why not vote Tory in that case? That there wasn't. It not only was it not clearly enough related to what the Lib Dem previous messaging had been, it also fundamentally wasn't a reason to have Lib Dems having political power. Because sure, the Tories would have cut taxes in a different way from if they had a one-party majority. But broadly speaking, if you want to cut taxes, why would you not vote, Tory? I think, though, the other lesson is that it's not just the two data points that we have. It's not just the Lib Lab Pact and the 2010 to 15 coalition, because there's also the experience of Grimond in the 64 to 66 Parliament. There is the much shorter February to October 74 Parliament. There's the Lib Lab Pact. There's the coalition. There's the 2017 to 19 Parliament. There's a consistent pattern here of when the parliamentary arithmetic throws up the Liberals, or then later the Liberal Democrats, as in potentially having sort of kingmaker type votes. it doesn't end happily for the party. There is a much bigger pattern there. The one exception is the weird 92 to 97 Parliament, because technically speaking, the Tories did lose their majority partway through that Parliament. And of course, the 97 election was a fantastically successful one for the Lib Dems, gaining huge numbers of seats. But that was a sort of hung Parliament on the basis of maths, but not a hung Parliament in terms of the politics, because the Tories lost their majority in the end because they kicked out a set of Eurosceptic rebels. They withdrew the whip from them, and those Eurosceptic rebels were never going to vote for, and at the time, very clearly pro-European Labour Party to be in power. So it was only technically a hung Parliament.
That's true enough, though it's worth remembering the probably one occasion when the Lib Dems did make a difference was in voting with the government, which had then, as you said, lost its majority over the Maastricht Treaty of the European Union. And that was absolutely the right thing to do. It was a distinctive thing. It was said, the Lib Dems care about Europe. We're an internationalist party. It reinforced the party's message rather than, I agree, the income tax cut just did nothing for the party's image at all.
And interesting, the Maastricht Treaty vote was pretty controversial at the time. I think it would be massively more so if social media, for example, had existed then, because back in that at that time, an ordinary party member, or even say a local constituency chair, or a council group leader, there was very little way they could express their unhappiness. You could write a letter to party HQ. There's in the way that publicly people can express their unhappiness.
That's true.
You can see political momentum build. And
people did write a lot of letters, I have to say. And I was policy director at the time of party HQ, and we were responsible. My small department were responsible for handling calls from actually mostly from members of the public, and we had just a lot of calls from party members and from Labour Party members. And you could always tell the Labour Party members because they were reading from a script, and we started correcting them when they got the script wrong. Eventually, we got so familiar with it.
Was that a script that had been organised by Labour Party HQ, do you think?
Well,
to try
I assume so, yes.
How bizarre. But one of the reasons it was so controversial was, although, as you say, voting for the Maastricht Treaty was fully in line with Lib Dem principles, of course, it came after a general election in which the Lib Dems had relatively muted our pro-European message. So again, there was a bit of a disconnect between what we had said in the election and then what, come a hung Parliament, technically a hung Parliament, was the sort of the crunch vote. Although I think, strictly speaking, actually at the time of the Maastricht vote, it wasn't yet a hung Parliament, but it was because of the number of Tory rebels on the issue that the Lib Dem votes were crucial to getting it through. So I think there is a consistent issue there that the real lesson is, what's the message you're going into previously, not so much the details of what do you agree subsequently. And in that sense, I guess maybe David Steele would argue that he sort of got it right with the Lib Lab Pact, because his focus was on the big picture, as in, I want the Liberals to look like they're an important player once again.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, I'm not entirely sure I agree with you about the previous platform we fought the election on being important. Because, let's face it, people don't pay that much attention to Liberal manifestos, and certainly not like 2 years later. I don't think I remember them. Though having said that, the Liberal message in the 74 elections have been to, create a degree of consensus between parties that seem to be drifting further apart, the Labour and Conservative parties, and to restore sort of moderation and stability to government. So I think the Lib Lab Pact could be seen to be in line with that. I think a bigger message is that we always have to look for distinctive things that no other party would say. And Paddy did that, I think, at the Maastricht, but also before that in the previous Parliament over the rights of Hong Kong citizens. And it's interesting that it's often international issues that give us that distinctiveness. And I think that's a consistent theme of Steele's career as well. He wasn't, unlike Grimond and unlike Ashdown, he wasn't particularly interested in policy. And I think he would recognise actually that was one of his weaknesses. And it helped to undermine him in the end. I guess we're going to come on and talk about the merger negotiations. But the one area he did care about, I think partly because of his background, he was brought up partly in Kenya, and he saw, racism and the evils of colonialism and apartheid. And these are all very big issues in the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s and 70s, more so than they are now, I think, or they are in different ways now.
Mm.
And that was always something that really motivated him. One, he opposed, for example, the South African rugby team tour in Britain in 1970, which was really dangerous in his own constituency, which is full of rugby teams and a lot of rugby-loving constituents. And he received a lot of flack for it at the time and almost lost his seat in 1970. But he stood up for that. And consistently throughout his career, he was always interested in foreign affairs and making the liberal, tolerant, anti-racist, anti-apartheid message.
Yeah, and I think that touches on a broader question about what overall was the biggest political impact of his career, but we'll save that for a little bit later. Let's get the 1980s out of the way first. So we've talked a lot about the Liberal Ag Pact. What then happened was, obviously, the Tories won the 1979 general election. The Labour Party began to splinter. The SDP was formed predominantly by parliamentarians leaving the Labour Party. There was a little bit of splintering from the Tories, quite a lot of members brought into the SDP who had not been involved in politics at all, but it was essentially a breakaway from the Labour Party. And rather than trying and encourage people to join the Liberals directly, actually Steele encouraged the creation of a independent, separate party, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. I mean, rumour has it that Jenkins offered to join the Liberal Party and Steele dissuaded him. I think that's not completely accurate. I think what Jenkins said, if you read Steele's memoirs, is that he could join the Liberal Party, but he didn't really feel he'd have much of a role to play then. Remember, he was out of British politics at the time. He was president of the European Commission. And previous, the party picked up previous Labour defectors. Chris Mayhew, for example, had been a Labour junior minister and hadn't really made a lot of impact when he joined the party in the 70s, mid-70s. So I think there was a feeling that the Liberal Party was quite good at appealing to disaffected Tory voters, but had never been very good at appealing to disaffected Labour voters. And quite rationally, I think, with a split off from the Labour Party, a new party led by Jenkins and others could appeal to Labour voters that the Liberals had been unable to reach. I think in retrospect, that was probably wrong, but it seemed an entirely rational view at the time.
And certainly the SDP's political appeal very quickly ended up being really very similar to the Liberals in terms of being better at appealing to... Now, obviously, in part, that may have been because there was a Tory government. So maybe it was just a natural facet of any new opposition party is that you can do better at appealing to people who are unhappy with the government.
That's true, though, of course... You have to remember what was happening to the Labour Party at the time under Michael Foot, who was an even more calamitous incompetent leader than Jeremy Corbyn, though I think rather more attractive personality. He managed to drive the Labour vote down to 28% in the 1983 election, which is kind of a historic low for them, worse than Corbyn even. And the alliance almost caught them on just under 26%. I mean, again, something to Steele's credit. That no Liberal Party or Liberal Democrat election result has ever been as good as that since the 1920s. But because of the first past the post system, of course, Labour got over 200 seats and we got 23 in 1983. And the problem then was that the alliance vote, a lot of people unhappy with Thatcher's approach to conservatism, so kind of soft Tories, but also a lot of Labour voters who were basically Labour voters but really didn't like Foot, either switched to the alliance or switched over to the Tories. So sort of similar to 2019 in that sense, though in 2019 we weren't able to play the attractive role of the alliance. So, but the problem then also was that the alliance vote was very kind of incoherent electorally. It's very spread very evenly across the country. So we had loads of distant second places or strong third places, but very few places where it was collected enough. And I think Steele, it's interesting again looking at some of the things Steele said. We did an interview with him, which was published in British Liberal Leaders, the History Group's book, which is worth reading, I think. And there was just none of the careful kind of analysis of voting behaviour that we have now, trying to identify the types of people who might vote Liberal Democrat, they're middle class, they're pro-Europe, whatever. None of that happened in the 70s and 80s, just the party tried to appeal to wherever it could do. So as a result, we had a massive vote, but not many seats.
Yeah. And, the 1987 election was a sort of rerun of 1983, but less successful. So,
well, I think and there's interesting because the alliance, I think there were a couple of problems there. The alliance had never really managed to. It was kind of its appeal was a bit amorphous, really. It never really developed a very exciting, distinctive message. And indeed, that was one of the criticisms that was made at the time, was that they wanted a better yesterday. And again, they were just appealing to the kind of moderate centre against the extremes of Michael Foot's Labour, then replaced by Neil Kinnock, who made Labour more electable in the same way that Keir Starmer is doing, I think, after Corbyn, and Thatcher, who was going ever more right wing. So, I mean, that was, let's not underplay that. That was a powerful message for many people at the time. And, we still got 23% of the vote in 1987. But it wasn't very exciting. It wasn't very distinctive. It wasn't very innovative. And you can criticise Steele, I think, for not really being interested enough in policy to drive a kind of coherent policy program through, or a coherent vision of what an alliance-led country would look like. The other problem, of course, was the tensions between the two parties. And that it had been a bit of a problem under Roy Jenkins, the SDP's first leader, particularly over the division of seats, which party would fight each seat in the 1983 election. It became quite a lot worse under Jenkins' replacement, David Owen, who took over in 1983, because Owen, unlike Jenkins, was not really, he never tried to be leader of the alliance in the way that Jenkins and Steele did. They wanted the two of the leaders, I think they saw an alliance as a genuine partnership of equals. They wanted to demonstrate harmony. They wanted to work together. I think both of them saw eventually the party's destiny, the two parties' destiny was to merge. Owen wasn't like that at all. He wanted to see an independent SDP that was quite different from the Liberals. And he always gave a higher priority to leading his own party over leading the alliance. So he would fight very, very hard for SDP positions and effectively took the SDP further to the right and more and more Thatcherite in many of its positions. Whereas and I can remember this personally, because this is when I was getting involved in the party, and seeing myself on the left of the party, as I always have done and still do today. I saw Steele, and I think many of us activists saw this. Steele always compromised. It was always the Liberal position that left out, because he gave a higher priority to leading the alliance than he did to leading the Liberal Party. Whereas Owen didn't care about that, so he stuck to his guns and always got the SDP view. That's a bit of a caricature, but the tensions came to a head, particularly over the defence debate, the row about nuclear weapons in 1986, which led to Steele's defeat at the 86 Assembly. And that was just the whole episode there was just, it should never have happened. It was a catalogue of horrible errors on the part of both Steele and Owen and others, but it damaged the party. The party lost, the alliance lost about a quarter of its vote in the opinion polls. And before that, again, it may be difficult to remember this. Now we're at kind of 6 to 8% in the opinion polls, but for most of 1985 and 86, the alliance was hovering around about 30% in the opinion polls. We were winning by-elections, we were doing really well in local government elections, beginning to kind of firm up the vote, and that dropped to just above 20% after the row at the end of 86. Then kind of drifted up a little bit, and then the alliance campaign in 1987 was just terrible, with two leadership campaigns that didn't coordinate with each other. Owen clearly would have preferred, it looked possible like there might have been a hung parliament after 87. Owen was clearly dropping hints that he wouldn't have nothing to do with the Labour Party. He preferred to do a deal with Thatcher, whereas for most Liberals that was just a horrifying thought. And Steele was saying, never any deal with Thatcher. We'd prefer to do something with Labour under Neil Kinnock. So it's not really surprising that campaign managed to drive the alliance vote downwards in the way that the 79 campaign, which Steele had led, didn't do. So the internal tensions within the alliance kind of brought it to an end finally. But I think Owen was a far more difficult person to deal with than Jenkins, but I think Steele's neglect of policy details that mattered to his party and to his activists, and his failures at party management, I think in the end kind of helped to undermine that. And I think if he'd been a bit better at both of those things, and I think he recognises this in his memoirs and interviews and so on, he'd said no one would ever give him full marks for party management and policy details, but I think he could have found lieutenants who could have done it better for him. I think we would have had a happier sort of ride throughout the mid-80s, and possibly ended up doing rather better in 87, maybe even holding a balance of power. But of course, we still face the problem of the alliance vote being spread far too evenly across the country.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that happened during that time, where there's again a parallel with Jo Grimond, is actually the third party local government base grew hugely in its strength, predominantly Liberal, although not there were also SDP councillors as well. But between them, that alliance local government base grew hugely. And again, as with Grimond, it seems to have been I think a really important factor for the party and indeed for local politics across the country, but one which wasn't really driven by the leader. That Steele, like Grimond, didn't really see the local government base as being something that the leader should worry about, put effort into, that would be part of his legacy or anything like that, did he?
Yes, I think that's quite correct. I think Steele was always focused on Parliament and on the national scene. Obviously, he had no problem with the fact that the two parties were doing well in local government. And that was really important. I think that local government strength was one of the things that kept the Liberal Democrats on the road after the kind of disaster of merger. And it was kind of enduring strength that the Greens, for example, didn't show when they briefly overtook us in '89. But yes, it was something that was happening rather separately from Steele and the parliamentary leadership. The Association of Liberal Councillors then, ALC, was I think far more influential in the party than ALDC is now. I mean, not to underplay the importance of ALDC, they're really important, but in addition to providing the kind of organisational support and backup for councillors and council groups that the LDC still does, the ALC, as it was then, was also seen as a source of new ideas and of a fairly radical critique of the party leadership throughout the alliance. And that kind of role in policy and in debates over party strategy isn't one that the ALDC really played in the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, although I think in fairness to the current ALDC sort of leadership, that in part reflects the success of their predecessors, particularly in ALC, in that the importance of the local government base is much... I mean, we're not quite there yet, really, in properly appreciating it all the time in the party, but it's massively moved on from the world of the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah,
and you can see that.
True. Yes,
you can see that in the recent party leadership elections, how much leadership candidates talk about the importance of winning local elections in a way that I don't think really featured in the Jo Grimond leadership contest was one that members didn't get a say in, but the Steele one, the Steele Pardo contest, again, I don't think local government featured in it in a way that it's just now the norm.
Yes, I think that's quite right. I think Paddy was the first leader who really properly appreciated the importance of local government.
Yeah. So after the second general election failure, or relative failure for the alliance, as you say, the vote share then is something we can only look on with envy a little bit at the moment. But after that second failure, one of the lesson that most people in the SDP and the Liberals drew was that just the fraction and overhead and difficulties of being two parties in an electoral pact didn't work. And it was much better to therefore be one merged party. The merged party was created. It got off to a really bad start. But one of the key decisions that David Steele made was to not want to be leader of the merged party. So he didn't put his hat in the ring. And I think that was quite genuinely him deciding he didn't want to do it. It wasn't that he had read the runes and that people didn't want him. I think probably he could have got elected as leader if he had wanted it. But what's your take on why he decided not to run?
Well, I think it's an interesting question whether he would have been elected, actually. There was a lot of speculation at the time about whether he was going to. But I think we have to remember the disaster of the merger negotiations. And again, a lot of party members weren't around. Current party members weren't around during that period. So it's worth remembering that although, I mean, on the Liberal side, pretty much everybody was happy to enter merger negotiations. I remember the debate at the 1987 Liberal Assembly, and it was an overwhelming majority to open negotiations and elect a negotiating team. On the SDP side, of course, the party was splitting. Owen opposed merger, and he resigned as leader when the referendum, the ballot within the SDP, went the wrong way, and was replaced by Robert McLennan, who had himself voted against the idea of merger, but then accepted the conclusion, the decision of the membership, and briefly served as the last SDP leader. So obviously the SDP was falling apart. I mean, that was, for those of us on the left and the Liberal Party, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. We despised Owen and the Owenites. We're quite happy to see them go. That obviously it was doing damage to the parties in the country. But the whole of the merger negotiations, I think, were then influenced by the feeling on the SDP side and on some of the Liberal negotiators that we wanted to appeal to Owen, that we wanted to maybe not bring Owen himself back into the merger party, but at least attract most of the Owenites. So again, you saw the same kind of thing, at least, this is from our perspective as Liberal activists. It looked like the Liberal team was always giving up, was always compromising with the SDP view. And we ended up with a party structure that looked a proposed party structure that looked a bit centralized compared to the Liberal Party, that gave more power to the leadership and less to the activists, and included things like the commitment to the support of Britain's membership of NATO in the preamble to the party constitution. Now, the preamble expresses the party's eternal values, so the membership of a defence organisation could not be described as a eternal value, but it's important to the SDP side because of the background that most of them had, or many of them had left the Labour Party because of the Labour's position on unilateralism. Again, the whole issue around nuclear weapons and defence was much more significant in politics in the 80s than it subsequently became after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It would be a bit like now arguing over whether or not the European Union should be mentioned in the preamble, in the sense that, as you say, technically the sort of purist answer is no, because these are eternal values. The European Union is a particular organisation. But you can imagine the practical outrage there would be from many members at the thought that, we're not committed enough to the European Union to mention it in the preamble. And I guess NATO was slightly similar in that respect, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, actually, because I was thinking, well, of course the European Union should be mentioned in the preamble. In fact, it is, though actually it's the European community, because that's what it was when the preamble was written. So maybe the federal board might like to think about updating that. But I think the ideal of European unity and working together with Europe is more in line with the party's basic values and principles than membership of a defence organisation. And you have to remember the arguments throughout the 80s with a very hawkish US president in post, the sighting of cruise missiles, US cruise missiles in British soil, which the Liberal Party voted against. It was, I said, much more of a kind of flashpoint than it. I mean, now I think it wouldn't be a big deal, to be honest. But though, in fact, we then subsequently removed NATO from the preamble in the merged party. But there was a lot of unhappiness on the Liberal side. The thing that really did steal damage, though, I think more than anything else, I think despite all that, we would have still gone on. The party voted for merger overwhelmingly, and it would have done anyway. The thing that really did the damage was that, as well as the structure of the party, the constitution and the preamble, which was what the negotiating team focused on, was that the policy statement, the founding policy statement of the party, which was left to the leaders to negotiate. And Steele, true to form, not being very interested in policy detail, basically left it to, I think, a couple of people in McLennan's office to draft, and then released the final draft of the document to the Parliamentary Party kind of on the eve of its publication in the press. And they hadn't seen it before. No one had seen it before. The policy committee hadn't seen it. The MPs hadn't seen it. I have a copy of it somewhere in my files. It is the most appalling document. I mean, it is so cack-handed. It sort of triggered lots of red flags that anybody who read it should have realized at the time. It committed the new party to replacing the Polaris missile system, the British independent deterrent, with Trident, which had been the main flashpoint over the defence debate in 86, 87. It advocated putting VAT on children's clothes. It wanted to scrap child benefit and mortgage tax relief, which then existed. I mean, actually you can provide intellectual backgrounds, sort of arguments for all these things, but in terms of the political sensitivities at the time, it was just stupid. And also it was really badly written. People don't comment on that, but it was just so crushingly badly written. And
it always strikes me as a good example of be careful what you wish for if you say that what the party needs to do is just be radical. It was a very radical set of policies. And actually, I think, as you say, there is a degree of intellectual coherence to them, albeit it wasn't written very well, but that it was an intellectual coherence that was many steps removed from where the party's views at the time, or indeed subsequently, have been. Yes. But I think to me at least, that document is a really good example of how talking about, oh, we just need to be radical with policies, is just in itself an utterly inadequate and not, statement, because it's easy to be radical. The difficulty bit is to be radical and to be right and to be popular. And actually, a political party needs its policies to be all three of those. If you simply want to be radical, you could still dust off many of the things in that policy document haven't been implemented in the intervening year. So you could simply, that would be radical. But I'm not sure anyone is going to call for that to be our next manifesto.
Yeah, when people say they want the party's policies to be more radical, they generally mean either they want the party's policy to be more what they think is right, or they think it just wants to be, they want the party's policy to be more exciting in some kind of undefined and probably completely impractical way. But anyway, the point is that it was completely the wrong document for the purpose it was designed for, and Steele should have realised that. And just the release of it was so badly handled. So it was released to the press, and then the press conference to launch it was cancelled. And I think at Paddy's insistence, there was a joint press conference organised instead, where there's a picture of it in David Torrance's biography of Steele, where you have the two leaders, McLennan and Steele, sitting down, and various Liberal MPs and SDP MPs lined up behind them. All of them are looking so unhappy and kind of, I think Paddy later described it as looking like prisoners about to be tortured, and they did look like that. And it was just, they were explaining why they had released this document, which of course was then splashed across the press, but actually weren't going to release it at all. You could hardly imagine a worse kind of episode, really. So that episode damaged Steele's views in the minds of the activists a lot. And I think it is not clear that he would have won against Paddy. I think he probably would have stood against him if he had stood for leadership of the merged party. He probably would have done, but not by very much. And I think then he would have damaged. But I think, he'd been leader by then for 12 years. The merger negotiations were themselves quite exhausting. I think he played around with the idea of a lot, and a lot of people urged him to stand, but I think probably you're right, he was never really very serious about wanting to stand himself.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think had Paddy still decided to stand, which I think he probably would have done.
Yeah, I think so.
I think Paddy would have had the great opportunity to say, look, we need to do something different after the essentially the in different ways failures of the elections under Steele's leadership. But the "it's time for a change" message would have been quite powerful.
Yeah,
and also the fact that Paddy had probably a more compelling message for the former Liberal Party activists over, his stance on some of the key controversies over the previous year. So yeah, Paddy.
Interesting, actually. I mean, Paddy in the end appealed both to Liberal Party activists because of his fairly radical stance on things like defence. He'd spoken in the debate on cruise missiles in 1981 when the party defeated Steele on the leadership on that position. And he also appealed to the SDP because, well, at the time then, his challenger was Alan Beath, who looked more like a more traditional Liberal, which wasn't particularly attractive to their former SDP members. Possibly they might have been more likely to vote for Steele, I think, but we never know. In the end, he didn't stand anyway, so he acted as joint interim leader of the new party, the merged party, the Social Liberal Democrats, along with Bob McLennan, until the leadership election in summer 1988.
At which point Paddy was elected, and we maybe should look at his legacy in a future episode. But let's just thinking about David Steele's overall legacy, and just backtracking to a point I half made earlier. One of the things he did, he was very much a part of extra parliamentary campaigning before he became party leader. So things like the campaigning over apartheid and the pressures to reform the abortion laws and so on. Steele was very much part of a wider sort of campaigning community in that sense. And obviously his private members bill was absolutely central to the introduction of more liberal and sensible laws on abortion in this country. So I do wonder whether in many ways Steele's legacy as leader, his legacy as a politician comes more from his time before becoming a leader. If you think about that private members bill on abortion, something like that would have probably happened eventually, but eventually might have been a decade or two later. It feels like there was a real difference that he made as a backbench campaigning MP. Well, he was Liberal Party frontbencher, but as a campaigning MP, as a non-ministerial non-party leader campaigning MP than maybe he made as leader? Or am I just reading too much into that extra parliamentary campaigning?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. Actually, I think there are three important things about Steele's career outside his leadership that we ought to just briefly mention. One was absolutely his decision to take up abortion law reform as part of his private member's bill in the 60s. I mean, it helped that you had a liberalising Labour government in power, and Roy Jenkins, I think, was Home Secretary at the time, who gave him a lot of support. But yeah, that was a difficult, it wasn't the obvious choice to make, and it got him a lot of flack at the time, but it was absolutely a very liberal thing to do. That was important. After he became leader, I think we can give him credit for at least two things. One is that he consistently supported Paddy in the early years of the Liberal Democrats. And I saw this at first hand. I was party policy director at the time, I started in September 88. And Paddy had a really tough time, really pretty much up until the 92 election. Certainly in the first 2 years, there were problems about the party's name, as you might remember, the dispute about whether it was going to be Social Liberal Democrats or Liberal Democrats. And I think, Paddy made a few mistakes, as leaders always do. And he came in for a lot of flack from the group of MPs round Alan Beath, not so much Beath himself, but people like Alex Carlisle were really quite unpleasant at times and very antagonistic. And Steele, I think probably Steele supported Beath or voted for Beath in the leadership election and probably agreed with a lot of the criticisms, but he was always very overtly loyal to Paddy, and I gained a lot of respect for him at the time. Having been, I said, a Liberal activist during the Alliance, not very happy with the direction of the Alliance, didn't like David Owen, thought Steele gave him too much. My view of Steele began to change quite a lot when I saw how he behaved towards Paddy. And then it changed another lot when I spent 3 weeks in his constituency in 97. One of the happiest general election campaigns I've ever had. He asked me to come up and help Michael Moore take the seat and keep the seat from him. And it was great. And Steele, actually, one thing about him is that he's not always very easy with people. He's naturally a bit shy, I think, but he really relaxes, like most of us do. I think he relaxes when he's at home amongst familiar surroundings, and I got to like him a good deal. But I think the other important thing about his post-leadership record was serving as presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament for its first term and helping to establish a lot of the routines and the disciplines of the Scottish Parliament in a kind of fairly uncertain period when nobody had done this before. So I think we should remember all those things. Yeah. But I guess I should
just mention a fourth, which is the less positive one, but definitely a lesson for the party and all parties subsequently, is in terms of some of the scandals and allegations there were about, for example, Cyril Smith during David Steele's time as leader. Just, you need to take allegations seriously and deal with them properly. There's an important lesson for us all.
Yes, I think that's absolutely fair enough. But I do think, actually, that even taking all those things into account, his record as leader is a really impressive one, and I think we ought not to lose sight of it. And I just want to quote from an assessment from two journalists, Alistair Mickey and Simon Hoggart, who actually wrote a book about the Lib Dem Pact. But I think their assessment of what Steele did during the Pact is a reasonable summary of his career as leader. And what they wrote was, in 1976, just before Steele took over, the Liberal Party was going nowhere at all. It lacked ambition, it lacked a lot of drive, and it lacked a leader who had any concept of what might be done with the votes and the support that the party had accumulated through the early 1970s. What Steele offered was a direction, a purpose, and an ambition. Within months of becoming leader, he had placed the party absolutely at the centre of British political life and had made it too important to be ignored by anybody. And I think that remained true throughout the whole of the rest of Steele's leadership. He transformed the party from a position where it really wasn't taken very seriously as part of British politics, maybe occasionally with by-election wins or the 74 election, but it was really a sort of bit player, to something that was central, still a third party, but a really important player in the British political scene. And that was true throughout the whole period of his leadership. And I think we should remember that.
So you've mentioned a couple of books along the way. So just as a final wrap up, what would you recommend for anyone who's been listening to this and either just can't work out the chronology of what happened when or wants to find out a bit more about David Steele?
So I'll recommend 3 books, and some of them will be familiar to previous listeners to this podcast. The History Group's book, Peace, Reform and Liberation, is the basic history of the party right from the 17th century through to 2011 when we published it. And obviously the chapter on the 70s and 80s follows Steele's leadership and the whole sort of context about what was happening. So that's a good sort of basic background. For more detail, look at the History Group's book, British Liberal Leaders, which has a chapter on every leader since the 1820s. Obviously, it's the leader chapter on Steele, written by David Torrance, who's a Scottish journalist, and did a pretty decent job, I think, of that. But also, in addition to that, we had an interview. We interviewed 3 leaders, Paddy Ashdown, Nick Clegg, and David Steele himself, for the book, and you can see the transcript of the interview in the book. And that's quite interesting about how he saw leadership, how he saw his strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
And then Torrance himself has written the only biography of Steele, actually, called David Steele, Rising Hope, Elder Statesman. And I think it's a thoroughly decent job. If you want more detail on Steele's career and analysis of his leadership, that's a good one to go to.
Yeah, I'll also include the book on the Liberal Pact as well, because I mean, partly just it's, as you say, with things like the play The House, that period of politics was just so fascinatingly dramatic, because it did feel like there were big questions about almost the survival of democracy and
absolutely, that's right,
of the country, and that they were often hanging on a wafer thin margins in late night votes in Parliament. There was I think we got a little bit of a taste of that with some of the Brexit stuff last year, in terms of that atmosphere being similar. But it's like 2019, I think, felt a really long time, a really long year for people involved in politics. But it was like 2019 extended over several years was what the late 70s were like.
Yeah, I think that's right. And against the background of possible economic collapse, I mean, it was never quite as bad as that, but it looked pretty bad with inflation and unemployment both going up in the way that they hadn't before.
It was right. If 2019 had happened with coronavirus and lasted 3 times as long, that's sort of what the late 70s were like.
Yes, I think that's fair enough. It was a very exciting time, though. I mean, it's when I got interested in politics. I was at school and then at university, and I mean, everything was exciting and happening. To be fair, we ought to mention that Steele himself wrote a book on the Pact called The House Divided, and also his memoirs Against Goliath are worth reading as well. But I think the first 3 that I mentioned are probably the ones to start with.
Excellent. Lots of reading to keep people busy then. So thank you very much for that, Duncan. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. You can find Duncan on Twitter at Duncan Brack, myself at Mark Pack, and this podcast at Bar Chart Podcast. Please do give us feedback. This is the second now of our shows talking about former party leaders. It may be the second and last, or the second of many, depending on your feedback. So do please tweet away to let us know what you thought of this. And of course, check out the Liberal History Group itself at liberalhistory.org.uk. I'll include that, as well as follow-up links to the various books we've mentioned and some other stuff in the show notes, and as well as a link to the previous episode about Jo Grimond. So thanks very much for listening, and until next time.